Far away in the cold, endless stretch of space, a small alien research crew faced a problem they had never imagined. Their ship, once humming with energy and hope, now floated silently, crippled by a sudden engine failure. The systems that usually kept them comfortable and safe were failing one by one. Lights flickered. Alarms went off intermittently. The crew moved quickly, checking panels, adjusting circuits, and trying to repair the damage, but everything seemed more fragile than before. It was as if the universe had turned against them, leaving them alone in the dark. They had sent out repeated distress signals, calling for help from nearby civilizations. The messages were clear and detailed, explaining their position and situation. They included coordinates, technical schematics, and even pleas for urgency, but every day that passed without a response made their hope shrink. At first they thought it was just a delay. Perhaps the signals had not reached anyone, or maybe they were still being processed. But as hours stretched into days and days stretched into more days, the truth became unbearable. No one was coming. No one cared enough to answer. The crew gathered in the control room, staring at the glowing screens that still showed empty space. Their faces were tense, a mixture of fear, frustration, and exhaustion. They were intelligent, resourceful beings, trained to survive in harsh environments, but even the strongest among them could feel despair creeping in. One of them tried to speak, attempting to calm the others with logic. "There must be someone nearby who received our call," they said, trying to keep their voice steady. "They will come. We just need to wait." But even as the words left their mouth, their own heart did not believe them. The silence from the stars was deafening. It seemed as if the universe itself was indifferent to their suffering. Every day that passed without a reply felt heavier, as though the weight of emptiness pressed against the hull of their ship. They tried to stay busy, running maintenance checks, calculating fuel consumption, rationing their supplies, and making small repairs where they could. But the sense of isolation was growing stronger, like a cold fog settling inside their minds. At night, when they allowed themselves to think without distractions, fear took over. They imagined the worst scenarios, drifting endlessly until their supplies ran out, encountering unknown dangers alone, or even worse, never being found at all. Some of them stared out into space, watching the stars twinkle in silence, and felt a strange mix of awe and terror. The universe looked beautiful, vast and infinite, but it also seemed cruel and unforgiving. It was as if they were just tiny specks, meaningless in the grand scheme with no one to care for them. One night, after another failed attempt to repair the engines, they gathered in the small common area of the ship. They had stopped trying to pretend everything was fine. Exhaustion was written on every face, and hopelessness hung in the air like smoke. "We might not make it," one of them whispered. The words were not meant to scare, but simply to acknowledge the truth. No one responded. Each person was lost in their own thoughts, thinking about what it would mean to fade away into the emptiness of space, to vanish with no trace, no memory, no one left to know they had existed. It was then that strange readings appeared on the scanners. At first, they thought it was another system glitch. The sensors were old, battered by the journey and prone to errors. But the readings continued, becoming clearer with every passing hour. There was something out there. Something alive. Something that did not belong to any known star system they had charted. The crew moved quickly, checking and rechecking the instruments. Their fear mixed with curiosity, because even in despair the mind seeks hope. Perhaps this was the answer they had been waiting for. Perhaps they were not alone after all. They adjusted their sensors to track the signals more accurately. The readings showed movement on a planet below, a world that seemed harsh and unforgiving. Mountains rose sharply against the horizon. Deserts stretched endlessly, and oceans churned with waves that crashed violently against jagged shores. The planet was alive, but it was not gentle. Every ecosystem seemed to be struggling for survival. Every creature adapting constantly to the harsh environment. And yet the readings indicated intelligence, movement that was coordinated, deliberate, and purposeful. The crew watched, holding their breath as the patterns became clearer. Strange, formidable creatures were emerging from the forests, deserts, and waters. These were not small, fragile animals. They were strong, resilient, and built to endure conditions that would destroy most life. They moved with confidence, precision, and awareness, as if the challenges of the planet had honed them into perfect survivors. The aliens realized something remarkable. These creatures were not just surviving, they were thriving. They were the product of generations of struggle, evolution, and adaptation. For the first time in days, a spark of hope appeared in the crew's eyes. If these creatures could survive such a world, perhaps they could help. Perhaps they could offer protection, guidance, or even a way off the planet. The crew knew they had to take a risk. They had no other choice. Every other civilization they had reached out to had ignored them. The universe had been silent. And now, the only chance for survival rested on the creatures of this hostile, untamed planet. Still, fear lingered. The creatures were unknown, and their strength was intimidating. Could they be trusted? Would they see the aliens as a threat or worse, prey? The crew debated these questions in hushed voices, each weighing the risks. But deep down, every one of them knew that waiting any longer could be fatal. Their supplies were running low, and the engine repairs were beyond their immediate capabilities. It was a gamble, but one they had no choice but to take. As they prepared to descend toward the planet, the crew worked in synchronized urgency. Every action was precise, measured, and calculated. Their hearts pounded, not just from fear, but from the anticipation of encountering something that could either save them or destroy them. The ship shuddered as it moved into the planet's atmosphere, heat and turbulence pressing against the hull. Outside, the surface loomed closer, rugged, alive, and filled with potential danger. The crew clung to the belief that this planet, in its raw and unforgiving nature, might hold the key to their survival. And so, with nothing else to rely on, they made the choice to reach out to the unknown. They sent signals, visual and electronic, demonstrating peaceful intent. They watched the forests, deserts, and waters for a response. Every rustle, movement, or shadow caught their attention. The alien crew waited with a mixture of fear, hope, and disbelief. They were no longer alone, yet they were stepping into a world where life itself was a challenge. They were at the mercy of beings that had been forged by survival in the harshest conditions imaginable. The first night on the planet passed with tension so thick it could be felt in the air. The aliens stayed within their ship, watching, analyzing, and waiting. Nothing approached, and the darkness seemed endless. But as dawn broke, the scanners picked up movement. Not chaotic movement, but organized and deliberate. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows, moving toward them with intelligence and caution. The crew held their breath, feeling a mixture of awe and terror. The creatures of this planet were coming forward, and the aliens' fate would soon be determined. In that moment, the crew understood something profound. The universe might have ignored their calls, but life on this harsh planet had responded. It was not the help they expected, not the kind they had hoped for, but it was real, tangible, and alive. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the crew dared to hope. Perhaps survival was possible, not because of technology or alliances, but because of raw resilience and determination, the same qualities that had shaped these remarkable creatures. The aliens prepared themselves, ready to face whatever came next. They knew they were stepping into an unpredictable, dangerous world, but they also knew that this encounter could change everything. The creatures were no ordinary life forms. They were the Deathworlders of Earth, survivors of unimaginable trials, and now they were coming to meet the stranded visitors. For the alien crew, there was no turning back. The universe had abandoned them. No one else had responded to their pleas. And now, in the silent tension of dawn, they waited for the first encounter that would determine whether they would survive or become just another forgotten story in the vastness of space. After the first signs of life on the planet, the alien crew felt a mixture of relief and unease. They had seen something moving in the forests and deserts below, creatures that were clearly alive, intelligent in some way and remarkably strong, yet the crew could not tell whether these beings were friendly or hostile. Their scanners could detect energy patterns, movements, and even some basic life signals, but there was no way to understand their intentions immediately. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow that crossed the uneven terrain made their hearts beat faster. The planet itself seemed to breathe. Mountains rose sharply against the horizon, their jagged peaks cutting into the thin atmosphere. Deserts stretched for miles, the sand shifting and rolling like waves in the ocean. Rivers snaked across the valleys, feeding life in their wake. Forests were dense, dark, and filled with sounds the aliens had never heard before. Each biome was harsh in its own way, each demanding survival skills that went far beyond what the crew could imagine. And yet somewhere within this rugged world, life not only existed but flourished in ways that defied expectations. The crew debated their next steps in low, careful voices. One of them suggested sending a scouting drone down to observe the creatures more closely, but even that seemed risky. The planet's atmosphere was unpredictable, and the creatures might react aggressively to foreign objects. Another argued that the safest move was to remain inside the ship, wait, and hope the beings below moved on. But the third member reminded them that waiting might mean losing their only chance at survival. Supplies were already dwindling, and they could not remain stranded forever. The harsh reality was undeniable. To survive, they had to take a risk. Finally, after hours of discussion, they agreed to attempt communication in the simplest way possible. Using lights, sounds, and energy pulses, they sent out non-threatening signals toward the planet's surface. They tried patterns that suggested no aggression, movements that could be interpreted as gestures of peace, and even small projections of warmth and light to show they were not a threat. The crew held their breath, hoping that these efforts would be understood, hoping against hope that the life below would respond in kind. At first, there was no response. Minutes passed, each feeling like hours. The crew began to doubt their decision. Perhaps these creatures were too primitive to understand, or perhaps too cautious, or perhaps too dangerous. Their thoughts wandered to the endless possibilities of what could happen if the beings reacted with aggression. But then slowly a pattern emerged on the scanners. Movements below were deliberate, organized. They were approaching, but carefully, analyzing every action of the ship and its occupants. Watching through the observation windows, the crew could see the shapes of the creatures as they moved closer. They were unlike anything the aliens had encountered before. Some were massive, with thick limbs and armored skin that reflected the sunlight like metal. Others were smaller but faster, moving with precision that suggested intelligence beyond instinct. They appeared to communicate among themselves with subtle signals, gestures, sounds, movements that were coordinated and purposeful. The crew realized that these beings were not merely surviving. They were thinking, planning, and acting as a team. The atmosphere inside the ship shifted from fear to cautious curiosity. The crew studied every movement, every sound, trying to understand what these creatures wanted. Were they curious, cautious, or aggressive? The pattern suggested a mixture of all three. They approached with care, testing the alien ship's defenses but without any immediate attack. Their actions were deliberate, measured, and full of intent. The crew could sense that these beings were not random threats. They were survivors, intelligent and aware of their surroundings, and perhaps capable of recognizing the aliens as potential allies, or at least non-threatening entities. The day passed slowly, each moment filled with tension. The crew observed how the creatures moved through forests, over rocky terrain, and across rivers. They could see the adaptability in every step, how the large ones used their strength to overcome obstacles, how the smaller ones scouted ahead and reported back, and how the entire group coordinated their movements almost as if they shared a single consciousness. The crew was amazed and deeply humbled. Despite the technological superiority of their ship, despite the knowledge and intelligence they possessed, these creatures had survived in ways that were far more challenging than anything the aliens had experienced. As night fell, the crew realized that the creatures had not retreated. Instead, they had formed a perimeter around the ship, maintaining a careful distance. Their presence was both comforting and intimidating. The crew could feel that they were being watched, studied, and evaluated. Every glance, every movement from below carried meaning. The aliens had never encountered such intelligence in nature. Creatures that relied on instinct but also demonstrated strategy, adaptability, and persistence. They understood that survival required more than strength. It required awareness, calculation, and resilience. The crew attempted to communicate again, sending sequences of lights and low-frequency sounds toward the creatures. They waited, scanning for any signs of understanding or response. Slowly, very slowly, they began to see patterns in the creatures' movements. Certain signals from the ship seemed to influence the behavior of the beings below. They adjusted their positions, approached a little closer, and then withdrew. The crew realized that there was recognition, even if it was basic, between them and the creatures. This fragile connection, tenuous as it was, became the first glimmer of hope in days of despair. Through the long night, the crew monitored the planet's surface. They observed the creatures hunting, foraging, and navigating the dangerous terrain. They saw how the massive ones could knock down trees, dig into the ground, and defend the smaller ones from predators. They saw the smaller ones darting quickly, avoiding danger and signaling warnings. It was a complex society, governed by survival instincts, yet layered with intelligence and cooperation. The crew noted each detail, understanding more with every movement. This was a world where every day was a struggle, where only the strongest, cleverest, and most adaptable could survive. And these creatures had not only survived, they had thrived. By the time the first light of the next day broke across the jagged mountains, the crew felt a subtle shift. The creatures' approach had slowed, and for the first time there was a sense of acceptance. They were no longer merely investigating. They seemed to understand that the ship posed no immediate threat. The aliens could feel it, a silent acknowledgement of presence, a tentative truce born out of mutual survival instincts. This understanding, unspoken and instinctive, offered hope that perhaps the crew would not be alone after all. The aliens knew that trust would have to be built slowly. They could not predict how these creatures would act in the coming hours. But they also realized that retreat was no longer an option. The planet's environment was too harsh, the engine repairs too challenging, and supplies too limited. Survival required engagement, observation, and cooperation, even if it was limited to cautious interaction for now. They prepared the ship for possible landing, ensuring that all systems were functional and that they were ready for any eventuality. As the day progressed, small signs of interaction emerged. The creatures began to mimic some of the movements sent from the ship, using gestures, sounds, and approaches that reflected a primitive form of communication. The crew marveled at this development. It was not full conversation, not complete understanding, but it was a bridge, a connection that allowed the aliens to gauge intentions, assess intelligence, and begin forming a strategy for survival. The realization that life in its rawest, toughest forms could respond, adapt, and cooperate was both humbling and inspiring. Throughout the day, the crew continued their observations, taking careful notes, running simulations, and refining their understanding of the planet's life forms. They saw interactions that suggested hierarchy, coordination, and even problem-solving. One small group used stones to reach higher food sources. Another group worked together to distract a predator, saving weaker members. Every action was a lesson in survival, adaptability, and persistence. The aliens could not help but reflect on their own civilization's reliance on technology, and how fragile it seemed compared to the raw, unyielding resilience of this planet's creatures. By evening, the crew had come to a realization that would shape the rest of their journey. The creatures were not merely wildlife. They were Deathworlders, beings forged by extreme conditions, unrelenting challenges, and constant danger. They were survivors in the truest sense. And now, these Deathworlders were aware of the aliens, assessing them, studying them, and possibly considering whether they could be allies or threats. The thought was both terrifying and hopeful. The crew understood that for the first time in many days, they were no longer entirely alone. As night fell once more, the aliens prepared for what would be a long, uncertain encounter. They monitored movements, analyzed signals, and waited for further signs of engagement. They could not speak to these creatures in any conventional sense, yet a silent understanding had begun to form. The planet, harsh and unyielding as it was, had responded to their presence. No other civilization, or... As the alien crew watched the planet's surface, the first true signs of the Deathworlders' emergence became clear. It was one thing to see movement on the scanners, but quite another to witness these creatures in action, moving with confidence, strength, and intelligence. The forests, deserts, and oceans below seemed alive in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. Every step, every sound, every gesture of these beings told a story of survival, struggle, and resilience. They were not just surviving, they were dominating the harsh world around them with skill that made the alien crew feel both awe and fear. The first to emerge were the massive creatures, towering figures with thick muscular limbs and skin toughened by centuries of adaptation, moved through the forest with surprising agility. They navigated fallen trees, rocky terrain, and steep slopes without hesitation. Their eyes, sharp and focused, scanned the environment constantly. These were not mindless beasts. Every action was deliberate. The crew noticed how they communicated with subtle gestures, nods, and movements, coordinating their path forward. Even from a distance, it was clear that these beings were intelligent, and the aliens could not help but feel a deep respect for their capability to survive in such a harsh world. Smaller creatures emerged next, quick and precise, darting between shadows and climbing rocks with speed that was almost impossible to follow with the naked eye. They moved in groups, scouting ahead and then returning with signals that seemed to influence the decisions of the larger creatures. The crew observed carefully, realizing that the planet's life forms were not just surviving individually, they were working as a team. They had developed strategies that allowed them to hunt, navigate, and defend themselves effectively. The level of coordination and planning was something the aliens had not expected from creatures of this world. The aliens watched in silence as the Deathworlders approached the ship cautiously. There was no rush, no immediate aggression, only careful observation. The larger creatures moved with slow, purposeful steps, while the smaller ones circled and observed, their movements alert and calculated. The aliens could sense the intelligence behind each decision. These were not random actions. They were the product of experience, instinct, and learned behavior. Every life form on this planet had been honed by survival, and now that instinctive intelligence was focused on the newcomers. The atmosphere inside the ship was tense. Every crew member held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. They knew they were vulnerable. Their ship, though advanced in technology, was not designed for defense against beings of this raw, brutal strength. Yet at the same time, there was a strange sense of fascination. The crew had never seen life like this, not in any of the galaxies they had explored. The Deathworlders were harsh, formidable, and unyielding, yet there was an elegance to the way they moved, a rhythm that spoke of millions of years of adaptation. As the creatures drew closer, the aliens began to notice their methods of testing. The larger ones would approach a small distance from the ship, then retreat slightly, observing how the aliens reacted. The smaller creatures would run forward and then back, almost playfully, yet with precision and purpose. It was as if they were evaluating the newcomers, learning their capabilities and deciding whether they could be tolerated or should be treated as threats. The crew realized that this was a form of communication, primitive yet effective. The Deathworlders were intelligent enough to assess, adapt, and respond to new challenges. The first physical interaction came unexpectedly. A large creature pushed a fallen tree in the path toward the ship, clearing the way. Another smaller one darted forward and touched a panel on the ship briefly, retreating immediately. These gestures, though simple, conveyed a message. The creatures were aware, observing, and capable of action without aggression. The crew began to understand that this was their opportunity. They could attempt to establish a connection, however fragile, and possibly earn the trust of these beings. The crew responded carefully, sending gentle signals of light and sound, hoping to show that they meant no harm. They did not know if the Deathworlders would understand or react positively, but they hoped that consistency and patience would bridge the gap between species. Hours passed with only small movements in response, but each response was a sign of recognition. Slowly, the aliens saw patterns emerge, signals that were mirrored, movements that were repeated, and small adjustments that suggested comprehension. The creatures were learning just as the crew was learning about them. Throughout the day, the crew continued to observe and interact cautiously. They noted how the Deathworlders coordinated among themselves, protecting each other, avoiding danger, and solving problems in real time. One group of smaller creatures worked together to reach a high perch, using teamwork and ingenuity to overcome an obstacle. The larger ones protected the group, blocking potential threats and observing the surroundings. The aliens marveled at this intricate system of survival, realizing that intelligence on this planet was not defined by language or tools, but by the ability to endure, adapt, and cooperate in a deadly environment. As the sun set, the crew reflected on what they had witnessed. They had expected fear, chaos, or even hostility, but instead they saw method, structure, and purpose. The Deathworlders had emerged not to destroy, but to assess, adapt, and survive. The crew began to feel a cautious optimism. Perhaps these creatures could help. Perhaps they could offer guidance or protection in this wild, untamed world. The realization that survival might depend not on advanced technology, but on understanding and respecting the instincts of another species was humbling. Night brought a different kind of challenge. The creatures retreated slightly into the forests and deserts, but remained within sight. Their behavior changed as the darkness grew, becoming more cautious yet still coordinated. The aliens noted how they used the cover of night to move strategically, observing the ship and its inhabitants without revealing too much of themselves. This adaptation to the environment, their constant assessment of threats and their precise movements highlighted a survival instinct that was both natural and remarkable. The crew felt a deep sense of respect for these beings, understanding that they had been forged by a planet that demanded strength, intelligence, and resilience at every turn. The first real contact was subtle but profound. A smaller creature approached the ship, stopping at a measured distance and remained still as if waiting. The crew mirrored the stillness, sending soft signals of light toward the being. After several tense minutes, the creature made a small gesture, touching the ground lightly and retreating. The crew interpreted this as a sign of recognition, a silent communication that acknowledged presence without aggression. For the first time, the aliens realized that a bridge was forming between themselves and the Deathworlders, an understanding born of observation, patience, and mutual assessment. The next few hours were a mixture of observation and interaction. The crew documented every action, every movement, and every reaction. They studied how the creatures communicated among themselves, how they solved problems, and how they responded to the aliens' presence. They began to notice subtle patterns. Signals from the ship could influence the creatures' movements. Certain gestures prompted specific responses, and even minor adjustments in behavior reflected awareness and decision-making. The crew understood that this was more than instinct. It was intelligence shaped by survival in the harshest conditions imaginable. By dawn, the crew had a clearer picture of the Deathworlders' capabilities. The creatures were not mindless or unpredictable. They were survivors skilled in navigation, defense, and problem-solving. They adapted constantly, observing, learning, and responding to new challenges. The aliens realized that these beings were the true masters of this planet, forged by evolution and necessity, and that any interaction would require respect, patience, and careful observation. The Deathworlders had emerged from the shadows of Earth's wild landscapes, and their presence was both a warning and an opportunity. As the day progressed, the crew became more confident in their approach. They understood that survival depended on careful observation, patience, and the ability to learn from these creatures. The Deathworlders had emerged not as aggressors but as evaluators, capable of complex coordination and understanding. The aliens knew that the next steps would be crucial, establishing trust, avoiding provocation, and demonstrating peaceful intent. Every action, every signal, and every gesture could influence the outcome of this encounter. By the end of Part 3, the alien crew had witnessed the full emergence of Earth's Deathworlders. They had seen strength, intelligence, coordination, and resilience in action. The creatures were not merely surviving. They were thriving in one of the harshest environments imaginable. The crew realized that these Deathworlders might be their only chance for survival on this hostile planet. The connection had begun, tentative and fragile, but it was real. And for the first time since their journey began, the aliens felt that hope was not lost. The following day, the alien crew realized that the situation had changed. The Deathworlders, which had been cautious observers until now, were beginning to interact with their presence more directly. At first it was subtle. A shadow moved across a nearby ridge, or a massive creature would approach, pause, and then step back, testing boundaries. The aliens could feel the intelligence behind these movements. These were not random actions. The Deathworlders were assessing, judging, and learning. They were aware of the newcomers, and they were making decisions about them in real time. The crew understood that this was a critical moment. Any sudden or careless action could provoke the creatures, yet inaction could be just as dangerous. They had to demonstrate peaceful intent but also readiness. Every light signal, every low-frequency pulse, and every movement from the ship was carefully considered. The crew worked together, coordinating their signals, ensuring that nothing was threatening or confusing. Slowly, they noticed the creatures adjusting their approach in response. The Deathworlders were learning, adapting, and responding to the aliens' behavior. A larger creature stepped forward first, moving with deliberate care. Its massive body reflected the sun's light, muscles rippling as it navigated the uneven terrain. Smaller creatures flanked it, their eyes sharp, scanning the area for potential danger. The crew watched in awe, realizing that these beings were not just strong. They were organized, intelligent, and strategic. They had a system, a method for survival that the aliens could barely comprehend. The forest and rocks were not obstacles for them. They were tools, pathways, and shields that could be used to their advantage. The aliens could see that the Deathworlders were testing them, trying to understand their intentions. The large creature paused at a safe distance, then moved closer and touched the ground in front of the ship. It was a simple gesture, but it carried meaning, a form of communication that was not aggressive yet not entirely passive either. The crew responded carefully, sending gentle light signals toward the being. Slowly the creature stepped back, then forward again, repeating the gesture. The aliens realized that they were witnessing the first steps of trust being formed. Throughout the day, the interactions became more complex. The Deathworlders began to coordinate among themselves, responding to each other's movements and signals. Some circled the ship, while others observed from higher ground. They communicated in ways the crew could not fully interpret, but it was clear that they were assessing the situation, sharing information, and making decisions as a group. The crew felt a growing sense of respect. These creatures were not mindless. They were problem solvers, capable of planning and adapting to new circumstances with remarkable intelligence. As the hours passed, the crew noticed something surprising. The Deathworlders were beginning to clear obstacles in the area immediately surrounding the ship. Fallen trees were nudged aside, rocks moved, and smaller debris shifted. It was as if the creatures were preparing a safe zone, creating space for the ship without causing harm. The aliens were amazed. These beings, forged by the harshest conditions, were showing a sense of awareness and cooperation that went beyond instinct. They were acting in ways that suggested understanding, strategy, and even foresight. The aliens realized that survival on this planet was not just about strength. It was about understanding the environment, adapting to challenges, and respecting the rules of life that had been set by the planet itself. The Deathworlders embodied these rules perfectly. Every movement, every choice, every action demonstrated resilience, intelligence, and a deep connection to the harsh world they called home. The crew began to understand that these creatures were not only a force of nature, but also potential allies in their struggle to survive. Despite the cautious optimism, fear remained. The aliens knew that any mistake could be disastrous. If the Deathworlders perceived a threat, the consequences could be deadly. The creatures were fast, strong, and adaptable. They had survived countless dangers and were capable of defending themselves with precision and efficiency. The crew could feel the tension in the air as they balanced the hope of trust with the reality of potential danger. Every decision, every signal, every movement had to be made carefully. By midday, a smaller group of Deathworlders approached even closer. They moved in unison, their eyes fixed on the ship and its occupants. The crew watched silently, studying their behavior, noting patterns and anticipating movements. The creatures tested the ship gently, nudging panels, brushing past the landing gear, and observing reactions. There was no aggression, only assessment. The crew responded with care, maintaining their signals, keeping their movements deliberate, and avoiding sudden actions. Slowly, a rhythm emerged, a pattern of interaction that suggested understanding and mutual observation. The aliens noticed that the Deathworlders seemed to understand the concept of protection. The larger creatures positioned themselves around the smaller ones, shielding them from potential danger, while the smaller creatures acted as scouts, observing and reporting. This hierarchy and coordination were remarkable. The crew realized that these beings were not just surviving, they were thriving in a dangerous world, relying on cooperation, intelligence, and adaptability. It was a lesson in survival unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. As the day progressed, the Deathworlders began to experiment with proximity. They tested how close they could get without provoking the aliens. Some approached cautiously, then withdrew. Others lingered near the ship's edges, observing silently. The crew responded carefully, maintaining non-threatening gestures and signals. They discovered that the Deathworlders were capable of learning and adjusting their behavior based on the aliens' responses. It was a dynamic, evolving interaction, built on observation, patience, and adaptation. By evening, the first true sign of cooperation appeared. A small creature nudged a piece of debris that was blocking the ship's entrance. Another followed, helping to clear the area. The aliens watched in amazement, realizing that the creatures were not only intelligent but also capable of coordinated action, that benefited others. It was the first tangible evidence that trust might be forming, that the Deathworlders were willing to act in ways that supported the aliens' survival. The crew felt a cautious relief, tempered by the knowledge that this trust was fragile and could be broken at any moment. Nightfall brought new challenges. The creatures became more cautious, retreating slightly but remaining within sight. The aliens monitored their behavior, noting how they adapted to the changing light and environment. The Deathworlders used darkness strategically, moving silently, observing and testing the aliens' reactions. The crew realized that these beings were masters of survival in all conditions, capable of adjusting their strategies based on environment, threat, and opportunity. It was both inspiring and humbling. The crew reflected on what they had learned. They had expected fear, chaos, or hostility, but instead they saw method, strategy, and intelligence. The Deathworlders had emerged not to attack, but to assess, understand, and interact. The aliens realized that survival depended on observation, patience, and respect. They began to see these creatures not as a threat but as teachers, guides, and potentially even allies in a world that demanded resilience, adaptability, and cooperation. By the end of Part 4, the alien crew had witnessed the first real signs of interaction and cooperation. The Deathworlders had tested, assessed, and begun to act in ways that demonstrated intelligence, strategy, and awareness. The aliens understood that survival on this planet would require careful observation, patience, and a willingness to learn from the creatures that ruled it. They had entered a world of harsh beauty and raw power, and the Deathworlders had begun to show them the rules of survival. The bridge of trust had started, fragile but real, and the journey toward mutual understanding and survival had truly begun. By the morning of the next day, the alien crew could see a remarkable change. The Deathworlders, which had been cautious observers and testers until now, began to act in ways that clearly showed a willingness to help. The aliens had watched for hours as these creatures moved through the forests, deserts, and rivers with a strange sense of purpose, and it became clear that they were aware of the newcomers' needs. The crew felt a cautious sense of hope rising, a feeling they had not experienced since they first became stranded on this hostile planet. It started with small gestures. A large creature nudged aside a fallen boulder that had blocked a safe path for the ship. Another used its immense strength to push a heavy piece of debris away from the landing area. The aliens watched in awe as the creatures worked together, coordinating their efforts without any apparent communication with the crew, but achieving results that directly benefited the newcomers. The realization struck the crew that these Deathworlders were not merely reacting. They were assessing the situation and taking actions to protect and support the aliens, even without instructions. Smaller creatures moved quickly around the ship, checking for hazards, examining the terrain, and making adjustments that would make the area safer for landing. They seemed to understand instinctively what the aliens needed, and their actions were precise and efficient. The crew could hardly believe what they were seeing. These were beings shaped by the harshest conditions of Earth, yet they were demonstrating intelligence, foresight, and cooperation on a level that surpassed even some of the most advanced civilizations the aliens had known. As the day progressed, the aliens became more confident in their attempts at communication. They sent gentle light signals, vibrations, and energy pulses toward the creatures, trying to reinforce peaceful intent. Slowly, they saw responses that mirrored their gestures. One large creature lifted a massive log and placed it aside after receiving a signal. A smaller creature approached and brushed against a panel on the ship, then retreated as if acknowledging the gesture. The interactions were subtle, almost imperceptible, but the crew could feel the growing connection. It was a fragile trust forming, built on observation, respect, and shared purpose. The planet itself, harsh and unpredictable as it was, tested the aliens even as the Deathworlders helped them. Strong winds swept across the open plains. Sudden rainstorms turned dry soil into mud, and jagged rocks and fallen trees blocked paths. But wherever danger appeared, the Deathworlders acted decisively. They created safe paths, removed obstacles, and even appeared to shield the ship from smaller predators. The crew realized that these creatures understood the environment in ways that they never could, anticipating challenges and addressing them instinctively. At one point, a sudden flash flood rushed through a nearby riverbed, threatening to wash away part of the landing area. The aliens froze in fear, unsure of what to do, but the Deathworlders reacted instantly. Large creatures used their strength to create barriers, redirecting the flow of water, while smaller ones worked to remove loose debris that could have caused damage. Within minutes, the immediate danger was neutralized. The crew could hardly believe their eyes. They had come to a realization that survival on this planet would not be possible without the Deathworlders' aid. These creatures had emerged not just as observers or testers, they had become protectors, guides and partners in survival. The aliens began to interact more confidently, responding to the creatures' movements with careful gestures and signals. They observed how the Deathworlders communicated among themselves, sharing information about the environment, potential hazards, and even the aliens' presence. The crew noted that these beings seemed to have a sophisticated understanding of cooperation, problem-solving, and protection. Each action reinforced the idea that survival depended on respect, observation, and learning from those who had already mastered life in this harsh world. By midday, the aliens faced another challenge, a rocky slope that threatened to collapse and damage the ship. The crew tried to assess the situation, but the terrain was treacherous and unstable. The Deathworlders acted without hesitation. Large creatures pushed rocks aside, while smaller ones climbed the slope, testing its stability and signaling which areas were safe. Together, they created a secure path, preventing potential disaster. The crew could not help but feel gratitude and awe. The Deathworlders had taken the initiative to help without expectation or reward. They acted purely because survival demanded it, and perhaps because they had recognized the aliens as non-threatening. Throughout the day, the aliens continued to learn from the creatures. They observed their problem-solving skills, how they adapted to obstacles, and how they protected one another. It was clear that the Deathworlders had evolved over countless generations to survive the most extreme conditions. Every movement, every gesture, and every decision was shaped by the harsh realities of their world. The aliens began to understand that technology alone could not ensure survival. Intelligence, adaptability, and cooperation were equally vital. As the sun began to set, the aliens realized that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The Deathworlders had become active participants in their survival. They had moved from cautious observers to protectors, demonstrating intelligence, coordination, and awareness that went beyond instinct. The aliens could feel the bond growing, fragile but undeniable. For the first time since their ship had been disabled, they felt that they had a chance, not just to survive, but to thrive in this harsh environment. Guided by beings who had mastered the planet long before their arrival, night brought new challenges, as darkness changed the dynamics of the environment. Predators stirred, and the landscape became harder to navigate. But the Deathworlders remained vigilant. Their presence offered both protection and reassurance. The aliens noticed how the creatures moved strategically, keeping watch, scouting, and ensuring that potential threats were managed. It was a level of cooperation and foresight that the aliens had never experienced, and it reinforced the lesson that survival depended on trust, observation, and collaboration. The crew began to experiment with more direct interaction. They used light, soft vibrations, and gentle gestures to signal gratitude and cooperation. The Deathworlders responded in kind, moving with deliberate care, demonstrating understanding and reinforcing the growing trust. The interactions became a rhythm, a silent conversation between species built on observation, action, and respect. The aliens realized that even in the vastness of space, survival could depend on connections like these, on the ability to learn from and work alongside life forms that had already mastered endurance, resilience, and intelligence. By the following morning, the aliens had grown confident enough to attempt more complex interactions. They tested how the creatures would respond to new obstacles, signaling for assistance and observing the outcomes. The Deathworlders adjusted immediately, removing debris, securing pathways, and even guiding the crew's attention to potential dangers. It became clear that these creatures were not only capable of protecting themselves, but also others, adapting their actions to the needs of those they deemed non-threatening. The bond between the aliens and the Deathworlders had strengthened, evolving into a dynamic relationship of mutual observation and support. The crew realized a profound truth. The Deathworlders' intelligence was not measured by technology or tools, but by survival, cooperation, and adaptability. They had emerged as the ultimate example of resilience, thriving where many others would fail. Every obstacle the aliens faced was met with instinctive guidance from these beings, and each challenge overcame together reinforced the growing connection. The planet, once seen as hostile and unforgiving, now felt like a place where survival was possible, not because it was easy, but because there were allies who understood the rules of life on this death world. By the end of Part 5, the aliens had fully realized the significance of the Deathworlders' emergence. They had moved from observers to protectors, guiding the crew through challenges, hazards, and unpredictable events. The aliens had learned that survival on this planet depended not on their advanced technology, but on observation, respect, and cooperation with these remarkable creatures. The bond formed was fragile, cautious, but genuine, a bridge between species forged in the harshest conditions imaginable. The crew now had hope, and for the first time in many days, they could imagine a future in which they might survive this hostile world, guided by the strength, intelligence, and resilience of Earth's Deathworlders. By the 6th day, the alien crew had grown to understand the rhythm of life on this harsh planet. The Deathworlders had moved from cautious observers to active guides and protectors, helping the aliens navigate a world that had once seemed impossible to survive. Every step, every action, and every gesture from the creatures had taught the crew lessons in patience, observation, and resilience. The bond between species had become undeniable, fragile yet powerful, built on trust forged in the face of extreme danger. The morning started with a subtle shift in behavior. The Deathworlders began anticipating the crew's needs even before signals were sent. Large creatures had cleared new pathways, ensuring the ship's movement would be safe. Smaller ones scouted ahead, signaling hazards and potential obstacles with a precision that left the aliens amazed. The crew realized that these beings were not just intelligent, they were wise in ways that technology could never replicate. Every interaction reinforced the lesson that survival on this planet relied on cooperation, understanding, and respect for life. One of the first challenges of the day came from the weather. Sudden storms, violent winds, and heavy rains were common on this planet, testing the limits of both machinery and living beings. The crew watched as the Deathworlders moved with instinctive coordination. Large creatures positioned themselves to shield the ship and its surroundings from falling debris. Smaller creatures darted across the terrain, checking the integrity of the landing zone and making adjustments where necessary. The aliens realized that these actions were more than instinct, they were strategy, shaped by countless generations of experience in survival. During one particularly intense storm, a tree toppled dangerously close to the ship. The crew froze, unsure if they could respond in time. But the Deathworlders acted without hesitation. A massive creature pushed the tree aside using sheer strength, while smaller creatures helped stabilize the surrounding area. The storm raged on, but the ship and its crew remained safe. The aliens felt an overwhelming mix of awe and gratitude. They had learned something fundamental. Survival in this world was not about avoiding danger entirely, but about understanding and adapting to it with intelligence and support from those who had mastered it. As the day progressed, the interactions grew even more remarkable. The crew began experimenting with more deliberate gestures, testing the Deathworlders' understanding and responsiveness. They sent signals indicating their intended movements and watched as the creatures adjusted theirs accordingly. The responses were precise and thoughtful, revealing that the Deathworlders not only understood the gestures but could anticipate the crew's needs. It was a silent conversation, built on observation and understanding rather than words, yet its clarity and effectiveness were undeniable. The crew marveled at the creatures' problem-solving abilities. At one point, a group of large Deathworlders identified an unstable rock formation near the landing zone. Rather than risk a collapse, they carefully removed the rocks and reinforced the area using smaller debris, creating a safe path for the aliens. Another group helped carry damaged equipment back to the ship. The aliens realized that these beings, hardened by the planet's extreme conditions, had developed an instinctive intelligence that could not be taught. It had been earned through survival. Even more impressive was the creature's ability to work together as a unit. Large and small, fast and slow, all the Deathworlders coordinated seamlessly. They shared tasks, communicated through subtle gestures, and adapted dynamically to changing conditions. The aliens began to see parallels to their own societies, realizing that intelligence and cooperation could exist without technology, without words, and without the complex systems they were used to. The Deathworlders had achieved mastery over their environment in the most raw and authentic way imaginable. By midday, the crew had grown comfortable enough to move more freely outside the ship. They began exploring the nearby terrain, guided by the creatures. Each movement was careful, measured, and synchronized with the Deathworlders' actions. The larger creatures led the way, clearing paths, while smaller ones scouted ahead for danger. The aliens felt a sense of reassurance they had not known since the beginning of their journey. In the company of these beings, they could finally explore the world without constant fear. The creatures' guidance went beyond physical protection. They taught the crew to read the environment, to recognize subtle cues indicating danger, and to understand how the planet's ecosystems functioned. Rivers, rocks, and forests were no longer obstacles but sources of knowledge. The aliens observed how the Deathworlders interacted with every aspect of their environment, understanding the balance of power, survival, and adaptation. It was an education in resilience, patience, and awareness that no technology could provide. By the afternoon, a new challenge emerged. A group of predators, large and aggressive, moved into the area. The aliens froze, unsure how to respond, but the Deathworlders acted swiftly. The large creatures positioned themselves between the ship and the predators, standing tall and firm. Smaller ones used coordinated movements to distract and mislead the attackers. Within moments, the threat was neutralized without a single injury. The aliens realized that these beings were not only guides but also protectors, willing to put themselves in danger to ensure the safety of those they had accepted into their space. The crew began to feel a growing sense of connection, not just with the Deathworlders but with the planet itself. They had started as helpless strangers, stranded in a hostile environment, but now they were participants in a system they had once feared. Every lesson, every action, and every interaction had shown them the value of observation, patience, and respect. They had learned that survival was not about dominance but about understanding the rules of life and adapting to them with intelligence and cooperation. As night approached, the crew gathered inside the ship, reflecting on their journey. The Deathworlders had guided them through storms, cleared obstacles, and defended them from predators. They had taught lessons without words, communicated through actions, and built a bridge of trust that transcended language or species. The aliens felt a profound gratitude. They had been alone, abandoned by the universe, and yet they had found allies in the most unexpected form. Creatures shaped by the harshest environment on Earth, resilient, intelligent, and unyielding. The final test came in the evening. A violent thunderstorm struck, far stronger than any before. Lightning flashed, wind howled, and rain pounded the ship. The aliens feared damage, even destruction. But the Deathworlders were ready. Large creatures reinforced the ship's perimeter, holding down unstable objects and creating barriers against the wind. Smaller ones darted through the terrain, checking for hazards and ensuring that nothing endangered the ship. For hours the storm raged, but the aliens were safe. They watched in awe, realizing that the Deathworlders had become more than protectors. They were guardians, guides and teachers demonstrating resilience and intelligence that inspired deep respect. By the next morning, the storm had passed and the aliens finally understood the full extent of what had occurred. They had survived, not because of technology, not because of advanced systems, but because of trust, cooperation, and the raw intelligence of the Deathworlders. The creatures had shown them the true meaning of resilience, the power of observation, and the importance of respect for life in all its forms. The aliens felt a profound transformation, not just in their understanding of survival, but in their appreciation for life itself. The crew began preparations to repair their ship, now guided by the Deathworlders' understanding of the terrain and hazards. Every action was informed by lessons learned from the creatures: how to navigate safely, how to predict environmental changes, and how to work with the ecosystem rather than against it. The aliens realized that their survival on this planet was no longer a matter of chance. They had allies, teachers, and guides in the Deathworlders who had mastered life in the harshest conditions imaginable. By the end of the 6th day, the alien crew had achieved a new level of understanding and capability. They had seen the emergence of life in its rawest, most resilient form. They had witnessed intelligence born of survival, cooperation forged in the face of constant danger, and trust built through patience and observation. The Deathworlders of Earth had not only saved them, they had taught them lessons that no civilization or technology ever could. As the sun set over jagged mountains and rolling forests, the aliens looked at the creatures that had become their protectors and guides. They realized that no other civilization had answered their calls for help. No other beings had come to their aid. Only the Deathworlders had emerged, powerful, intelligent, and resilient, offering the chance for survival in a universe that had seemed indifferent. The aliens felt a deep sense of gratitude and humility. They had learned that the universe was not only vast and dangerous, but also filled with unexpected allies, capable of teaching lessons that went beyond technology and knowledge. By the time night fell, the alien crew had fully embraced the lessons of survival, respect, and cooperation. The Deathworlders remained vigilant, guiding, protecting, and teaching in silence. The aliens had transformed from frightened strangers into participants in a system of